start
Love it.
us off officially. All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to tonight's program, a discussion with Christina Lane, author of the book Phantom Lady, Hollywood producer Joan Harrison, the Forgotten Woman Behind Hitchcock. So before we get started, my name is Andy Wolverton, and I'd like to thank Darnice Jasper, my co-host and partner in crime, for joining me tonight. Darnice and I are both librarians with the Anne Arundel County Public Library System in Maryland, which sponsors this program. And a special welcome to anyone joining us for the very first time. If you're new to the group and would like to be on our email list, please send me an email at awolverton@aacpl.net. That will keep you up to date on all the latest news for all of our movie events. Now, if you were with me at any of our in-person library movies over the years at the Severna Park Library, you probably know I'm a big Hitchcock fan. We showed several Hitchcock films, yet we haven't really discussed any Hitchcock films currently on Canopy, even though Hitchcock's name has come up in several of our discussions. One name that hasn't come up very often, but should, is that of Joan Harrison. Now, if you've read our guest's newest book, Phantom Lady, you already know about Joan Harrison, one of the most important people in Hitchcock's career, a woman who, up until now, really hasn't been given the credit she deserves. So, in addition to being the author of Phantom Lady, tonight's guest is also the chair and associate professor of the Department of Cinematic Arts at the University of Miami and the director for the Norton Herrick Center for Motion Picture Studies. She has also written the book Feminist Hollywood, From Born in Flames to Point Break, a study of the 1999 movie Magnolia, and many other articles and essays on film. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming tonight's guest, Christina Lane. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andy, for that generous introduction. Thank you for having me here tonight. Thank you, Darnice. It's such a pleasure to be here. What a great group. I feel bad that I haven't been here before, and I'm going to be here more often to join you guys to discuss movies. And I was also just saying to Andy before we began that I'm from Maryland, so this is like a great homecoming, I guess, in a way, virtual, return to Maryland. I think that my mom she signed up to join. She's in Silver Spring, Maryland now. So if my mom comes in at a certain point, hi, Mom. Anyway, hello, Gretchen. So anyway, thanks for having me.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And I think I told you, Christina, the book Phantom Lady is in our library system. There's not a huge number of copies, but people are checking it out. People are reading it. Several people have gotten back to me and said, this is a terrific book. And I said, come to the program. You can tell Christina herself, this is a terrific book. And it really, really is a wonderful book. And we're going to jump into the book and questions about Joan Harrison, Hitchcock. But Christina, tell us a little bit first about yourself. What got you interested in movies in general, and then later involved in teaching and writing about movies?
So I can't say that I was a kid who grew up, devouring movies. I kind of got into this a little bit late, more in college. And I really, I went to a women's college and I began to watch a lot of movies as a kind of coming into consciousness about the world. So I just began to watch a lot of documentaries when I was in my, early 20s, and a lot of documentaries about kind of women's experiences. So that's where I came into it from, kind of wanting to change the world. But I quickly actually fell in love with classical Hollywood cinema, and particularly these Gothic kind of women's psychological thrillers. So that's what hooked me in, is, these films just like Rebecca and Suspicion and some of the films that I write about in Phantom Lady. And I have been watching all kinds of movies ever since. It's not that I have a particular affinity toward classical Hollywood films, because I also write about contemporary movies and films by women, films by men, etc.
And we talked a little bit off the air about Joan Harrison, but can you tell us a little bit about when and how did you decide to write about Joan Harrison?
So yeah, and thanks. I first kind of found her when I was taking a graduate course in Hitchcock. And I mentioned Thomas Schatz in my acknowledgments. If anybody ever reads acknowledgments of books, which I don't, I don't think that they do. But this is kind of important to me because I just feel indebted to Tom Schatz, who has done a ton of, scholarship on Hitchcock and on film noir and the Hollywood studio system. And he's the person who basically at the University of Texas at Austin, he was my, right, he was one of my professors, and he saw that I liked studying women. And there's an archive there, the Harry Ransom Center, which has the David O. Selznick archives. And then within that has a lot of Hitchcock files. So I think Tom Schatz basically said, if you want a topic, you should really go find some of these files on Joan Harrison. She's somebody that's understudied and nobody's really done a lot of research on her. And this was in like the mid 1990s. And I think just to say, I want to kind of go out of my way to say that he's somebody who really writes about like men, right? Selznick and Hitchcock, these male universes of producers and directors. And also if he's writing about movies, it's Westerns, and gangster movies. And I feel like he just knew he was never going to write a Joan Harrison book, but he also knew enough to know there was a book there. So I really feel, again, indebted to him. And also, I think at the time, I didn't recognize how important that was because it planted seeds that then took decades, for me to kind of develop. But in the meantime, I began to again, I just wrote like a paper. Right? I just wrote a paper in a class. but then I began to latch on to the fact that there's so many women who have been influential in his career, in addition to Alma Revel, his wife, who was the most important woman in his career, but also Sally Benson with Shadow of a Doubt and J. Preston Allen, who wrote Marnie, and then all these women who worked with him in that capacity as development and pre-production. And as J. Preston Allen said, when she, as the writer of Marnie, she told me, I really think that he preferred to work with women. If he'd had his way, he wouldn't have worked with men at all. I don't know if that's, 100% true, but it's a new way of seeing Hitchcock. So I, for a long time, thought I wanted to write a book all about all the women, and it took me a long time to narrow things down.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you chose the subject you chose. Well, Christina, if we could go back in time, and I wish we could do this, and interview audience members as they were coming out of the theaters after seeing a Hitchcock movie that Joan Harrison worked on or contributed to, or even ask people that watched Alfred Hitchcock Presents at home on television, we might ask, can you tell me, who is Joan Harrison? Mm-hmm. What do you think the reaction would have been back then? Do you think people would have known who she was?
Probably not. So, I think that the average moviegoer coming in off the street would not have noticed her in the credits, would not have known Joan Harrison as a name. But I think if someone who had read a lot of fan magazines, read Time magazine, maybe read movie coverage in the New York Times, because there was so much promotion about her as the female Hitchcock or the mistress of suspense. And, at least for 4 or 5 years in there in the 1940s, there was a great deal of buzz around Harrison. Some people would have known her as kind of a star producer, but I don't think that many people would have. And in terms of the television series, I guess, moving kind of into the 50s, there were enough pieces like in the TV Guide, focusing on her, that again, like a sliver of people would have recognized her name, but it got lost most of the time.
Well, and again, I'm glad we're talking about her, and there's a renewed interest in her. That's wonderful. Christina, there's in the prologue of your book, you state, and this is a quote, Alfred Hitchcock would not have become Alfred Hitchcock without Joan Harrison. And again, your book is a wonderful journey chronicling Harrison's influence, not only on Hitchcock and his work, but also it was a huge influence on other women in film then and now. Yet Harrison has not really been celebrated enough until recently, thanks largely to your book. So for anyone in our audience tonight who perhaps has not yet read the book, can you tell us why people, including some avid Hitchcock fans, really haven't given Harrison her due?
Um, and I also just want to say that, I do make that kind of polemic statement that most people do kind of have said that Joan Harrison was made by Alfred Hitchcock, that she wouldn't have been um, a name, or she wouldn't have been Joan Harrison without Alfred Hitchcock. So I wanted to turn that inside out to get to shine a spotlight on the fact that I do believe that their early collaboration in the mid 1930s helped him find himself, right? And also that their long-term collaboration over decades and decades continued to mean so much to him that, like, if we extracted her out of the picture, who knows, who Alfred Hitchcock may have been. Obviously, he probably would have still been a director that we talk about, but I don't know that he would have been Alfred Hitchcock as we know Alfred Hitchcock to be. So I just wanted to tease that out, and force people to think a little bit about who he was and how women shaped him. So I recognize that it's a pretty big sweeping statement, right? It's a kind of overstatement, but the question of, so I got distracted by my own. So the question of, ask me again.
Oh, people that haven't, even avid Hitchcock fans may not really have either recognized her name or spent a lot of time knowing who she is. But that's great to see, and the conversation has started. And one of the things I really like about your book is it talks about some of the films that go beyond Hitchcock when Harrison was a more of an independent producer, like Phantom Lady, which has a tremendous lead role for Ella Raines, and that was some of the types of roles for women that we didn't normally see. I mean, here's the woman who is acting as the detective. She is the driving force in the film, and not some guy detective or tough guy. And we see that all throughout Harrison's other works, not just the Hitchcock ones. So maybe you could touch on a couple of those as well.
I'm happy to, and I'm also happy to circle back to the question that I ignored, so I can
That's
always
okay.
ask that later. About kind of why most people don't know, who she is, why she kind of got buried within the Hitchcock history. But in terms of, for example, Ella Raines' character in Phantom Lady, and the kinds of women that Joan Harrison helped to she envisioned a different kind of woman, right? In 1940s, particularly noir and suspense films. And we begin to see them in films like The Lady Vanishes, right? In the Hitchcock movies like The Lady Vanishes or Jamaica Inn, or Rebecca or Suspicion, or even those kind of spy films like Foreign Correspondent. But with something like Phantom Lady, as I talk about in the book, it's a film where you do see that character of Ella Raines going on like a feminist quest, where she begins as one person, and by the end she's had such an incredible arc that she just has become a different person inside. And you can go back and forth in terms of, well, she's going to marry the hero, so does that kind of basically create like a status quo in terms of the power that she's gained. But regardless, she basically comes in, and Ella Raines is the one that depicts this in a 1948 or 50, it's either late 40s or late 50s, Saturday Evening Post article, where she says, that the character she loved best, was Kansas from Phantom Lady. But she says she basically comes in as this kind of innocent from, the Midwest, and she's kind of squeaky clean. And then she transforms in 3 or 4 different ways, because she finds a reason to pursue the Phantom Lady, but it's for justice. You know, it becomes her quest to basically make things right. And in the process, she becomes a very transgressive woman who has to basically um, break all these rules, you know, break all of these rules under kind of going underground. So she does become basically an investigator, but also somebody who, um, well, just also like bonds with all of these women in the background and essentially becomes like a feminist, you know, she becomes the center of her own story, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
And to link that up, because you asked me about kind of the other, maybe Joan Harrison's other films, and I would at least link that up to Ride the Pink Horse. You can see threads in every Joan Harrison movie, but Ride the Pink Horse is an obvious one where you have Wanda Hendrix's character of Pila, who was just written as a much more meek woman in the Dorothy Hughes novel. And when Joan comes in and adapts that film, Pila becomes a much more active agent and a really three-dimensional, you know, character.
I love that film a lot. Both of those, Ride the Pink Horse and Phantom Lady, and some of the other ones that hopefully we'll get to in just a moment. Well, I know we have several questions waiting from the audience, so let's turn it over to them. Darnice has probably been keeping a list of hands raised and questions in the chat. So Darnice, who do we have first? And
Let's go to Susan first.
okay.
Are you ready, Susan?
Susan, are you there? Susan.
Yep, there she is.
Hello.
Okay,
Sorry.
great.
I got you now.
I'm having old lady problems unmuting myself. My question is, I watched Rebecca again and Foreign Correspondent and a little bit of Jamaica Inn, which I didn't really like that. Couldn't really get into it that much, but I noticed Rebecca, by the way, is my favorite Hitchcock movie of all time.
Yes.
And because I like that Gothic, and I like the way the character who with no name turns out to be the strength. She kind of holds up her, what's his name? The husband, Olivier's character.
Maxim.
Anyway.
Yeah, Maxim de
Yeah,
Winter.
Maxim.
Mhm.
But the question I had was that she is listed as the co-writer in those movies. And I was wondering what part of the movie she wrote, why she wasn't the single person to write, and why she seemed to always have someone else writing with her.
That's a really good question. I'm so glad that you asked that. And Rebecca's my favorite Hitchcock movie too. So you've got, I'll watch it anytime with you. We can watch together online. So it was actually really standard in that classical Hollywood system and also in the British system for there to be multiple screenwriters. It was rare that you would have one single name attached to a script. And partially that's because people in that time had different skills. So you would have somebody who was better at like adapting, you know, the source material or the novel into like the architecture of the script. Then you'd have somebody who was known only for dialogue. They probably came out of theater and that dramatic tradition, and they would do that crisp, you know, kind of rat-a-tat-tat dialogue writing. You would even have people that were assigned to certain characters. And this was true for all genres. You know, for example, if you look at the Thin Man, you know, series, you tended to have screenplays go through one or two different, you know, renditions or teams. So in terms of Joan Harrison, though, for example, with Rebecca, there were 5 screenwriters, and it started with Joan Harrison and I think Michael Hogan, and the 2 of them were working on it in that adaptation phase. Then Michael Hogan steps off, especially once this whole thing moves to the United States from Britain. And then I'm not going to be able to remember everybody who steps on and steps off. I know, you know, Robert Sherwood comes in at the very last at the very last minute, and he helps come up with the way that they basically create that boathouse confession sequence, which was basically the thing that was killing all of them, is how to wind up making sure that Maxim wasn't really a murderer, because they needed this film to pass the censors. So he was really good at solving last minute problems. He was also really good at dialogue. So he was fixing some of those dialogue moments. So one of the things that is important to remember is that Joan Harrison was, for most of these films, the person who was there at the beginning and stayed there all the way until the end. And that's the case here. She worked on the film for 18 months, whereas a lot of these people would come in just for 1 or 2 months. So she was and that's why I say she was a creative producer, because that was the most important role of a producer who's the creative, is to keep the vision intact.
Awesome.
Great. Who's next, Darnice?
So we've got a question from Gary in the chat. Did Harrison ever consider directing? It's interesting to see her working for the great auteur director, and then she became a great auteur producer.
Yeah, and I think I do make that case in Phantom Lady, that I do think as a producer she was an auteur. You can really see her vision from film to film. She spoke in articles about whether she wanted to direct, and she was really clear that role was too technical for her. She wasn't interested in taking on the technical craft of directing. And she also, for example, she would say, I like to be home by 5 or 6 at night, and I like to leave my work at the office, which is something she didn't feel a director could do. They would need to be obsessing about shot for shot and everything.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so next we have one more question in the chat. Karen said that she watched Phantom Lady, and as a producer, how would Joan Harrison have impacted the way characters were portrayed or the story played out?
That's so remembering that, I think today we think of producers as being the money people, the people who go out there and get financing, and also do kind of the nuts and the bolts of just making sure that you've got all the different key players in position. And so she did that, but she also did exactly what you're asking. Like, her major role was to start at the beginning, at the conception phase of a film, and basically think about character, right? Think about character and story arc, and decide what she wanted to take and leave from a novel. Why make this movie? Why, what is an audience going to like? Who's your audience, and what do they want to see? And also she would ask the big questions. I'll speak specifically about the collaboration with Hitchcock, because I think this is most important, and I talk about this a lot in the book. Is you really need to understand Hitchcock's working methods, and he did seem to see things, right? And he worked in terms of these kernel moments or these vignettes. So, he would see Norman Lloyd or the saboteur, right, falling off the Statue of Liberty. And he would see the carousel, right, in Strangers on a Train, just kind of spinning out of control. So he would hand these to the screenwriter, but he had no real idea about how to string all this together or put it into some narrative cohesion. And he really could care less about character depth, and where the character went from beginning to end. And Joan Harrison, she just loved character. She came from a literary place. She brought that literary influence into the team. And truthfully, she could care less about plot. And you can see that from some of her movies. She just really didn't care. So she invested everything in character. And that's one reason why they worked so well together.
Awesome.
Great.
Okay, so Chuck is next.
Yeah, hi. My question is regarding, you guys mentioned Ella Raines earlier, and Phantom Lady, a movie I love. And actually, a lot of my favorite Ella Raines movies are movies that Harrison produced, also The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry. So I was just curious, why do you think they had such a good working relationship together?
I'm so glad you asked this question. Thank you so much. I think that they, Joan Harrison was 13 years older than Ella Raines, and so it is a bit odd that they would really see each other kind of on the same level, and that they were such buddies. And I talk about in the book, they were kind of a study in contrasts, you know, blonde and brunette, and Joan Harrison kind of wore her hair really tight, you know, with all these kind of ringlets, and Ella Raines just kind of had a different style. And partly I think that drew them together, that, you know, Ella Raines also, I guess, between you and me, right, between us, in the group, my understanding is that she wasn't the easiest person to get along with. You know, she wasn't a smooth personality. And she would tell you this too, that she just was kind of rough around the edges. Joan Harrison loved people like this. She that's one reason why she worked so well in the industry, is there was this magnetism, you know, this I talk about with Merle Oberon as well. I think that there was this way in which, probably coming from Harrison's own kind of family background, that she was actually subconsciously drawn to like the storminess in people. Robert Montgomery, right, would be another example. And I don't know that she came into that relationship, say with Ella Raines, feeling like she needed to fix someone like that, but she just enjoyed them. Like it was the drama, you know, she liked drama. She liked going to the theater. So, and partly because she was so cool, calm, and collected that she could just hang around, enjoy it, and then leave. You know, she was very detached. So anyway, I you know, there's some speculation. I really that they were flirtatious with each other. I think that flirtation was something that they did as a show, and that was also part of the reason that it worked for the productions. You know, that Phantom Lady then kind of spun off into The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry, and then it maintained, right, all the way. They kept wanting to make more films together through all the way to like 1950. They kept buying into properties and trying to make more films, and then all the way to Janet Dean, Registered Nurse, the TV show. Thanks.
Yeah, great question.
So now we've got Jan. Yep, unmute yourself.
Jan is Americanized into Jan. Hello.
Jan. I don't know why I wanted to make you, you know, Swedish. Go ahead.
Couple of questions about you won't believe me.
Mm.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
A little bit, mostly.
A little bit, breaking up a little bit.
Okay. Let me try. I'll put it in chat if I need to.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions about They Won't Believe Me. I'm interested about Joan's support of Jane Greer at RKO. Do you think it would have continued if not for Howard Hughes? And would you talk about one of the biggest news of the year, the restoration of They Won't Believe Me?
Awesome.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we know we've got the release. It's May 7th with the Turner Classic Movie Film Festival, and the restoration looks like it's going to be amazing, coming out of the Warner Archive. I know that Eddie Muller was instrumental in getting this done. I can also tell you that he was working behind the scenes leading up to that screening of They Won't Believe Me on TCM in September, this past September, when he invited me on to do the introduction. So we were really hoping that it would be out for that airing, for the broadcast. And so unfortunately it wasn't there for that, but it's coming out in May, and then it will be out on Blu-ray. So you can have it on like that physical media on Blu-ray. And I don't know, you know, and so the big deal is that there were 15 minutes cut. I guess that's your bigger question. There were 15 minutes cut out of They Won't Believe Me after its release. And they were cut out of various, you know, places in the film. And I think that there's been a lot of buildup around it. Some people have basically created almost a mythology, as though there were a lot of sexy parts, you know, and very like promiscuous and sensationalist, you know, parts that were eliminated. But if you talk to Eddie, who's one of the people I know that's seen it, and I have not seen the 95-minute version, which is the longer version, it's actually not necessarily all that big of a deal. Like, you don't miss that much plot wise, and you don't even necessarily miss that much in terms of the relationships or the, or like what would have been censored. But that it just feels like a more complete film, So it'll be great to see. Great. It's great to see it, and it's also just really nice to in terms of the people who worked on it, to know that it will finally be back intact. In terms of Jane Greer, because I'm trying to speak as quickly as possible because I could go on forever, and I know that there are a lot of questions.
It's okay.
So, and one of the things that you're getting at is that Joan Harrison helped groom Jane Greer. They Won't Believe Me was not Greer's first film, but it was kind of her breakout film, where Harrison helped Greer find a new persona and feel really confident about her performance. And then soon after that, she was in Out of the Past, which really, blew out big. And so if Joan Harrison had not left RKO, I'm absolutely sure that they would have done more films. And Greer spoke so highly of Harrison in many interviews. So I believe that that would have been a great working relationship.
Great. Okay, so we're gonna go to the chat questions, and then we'll go to Vanessa. Sue asked, why did she leave Hitchcock? Were there some bad vibes? What ended that relationship?
Oh, and can I also say that I love the book, I love the writing, I love Joan Harrison. Thank you so much. It's just a fantastic book.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you could take the rest of the session if you want and just say that. I don't mind. Thank you very much. So yeah, I don't think that there were bad vibes. I don't think that they left on a bad note. But I do think that Joan Harrison realized, in a way, she was just making the same movie over and over again with Hitchcock, that she'd really done everything that she could do with him. And she had so many ideas, of her own, and she was never going to be able to explore them if she stayed on his team. So it was time to go.
Okay. Okay, so then Gary asked, he was not prepared for the Robert Montgomery, the experimental creative director. You seemed fascinated and conflicted about Montgomery. Is that the case, or was I reading something that wasn't in there?
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I was.
I loved the book too. It's an awesome book. Loved it.
Thanks. Thank you so very much. Yeah, you totally are on point, because I think his politics are really hard to handle. I think it's pretty clear that he was, on the extreme right. And also everybody that you talk to just says he was such a jerk, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, but there is someone who tried for many, many years, and I won't say who it is, but to write a biography, with him. And then after his passing, is for a while trying to write a biography. And he has some nice things to say about interacting with Robert Montgomery. And I did talk to him and got a lot of great insight. But besides him, especially women, they just have nothing to say about Montgomery's treatment of them. And he just seemed to be rather inhumane and disrespectful. So that was actually where I started to get confused. I was, I know that Joan Harrison was a person who just didn't take disrespect. She didn't take, she wouldn't have been working with somebody who was a jerk to her every day. So it must have been a working relationship of respect, like it had to have been, unless she was, again, kind of so desperate and needed that political shelter during HUAC and during the Red Scare that she would have worked for almost anybody to stay safe. And that was really what I was working through in the book, is truthfully, I don't know if it was that bad for her. And so if it was, then maybe she was in a squeeze. But I believe that I just try as hard as I can in the book to give Joan Harrison agency, as much agency as I can. So even with him, I was trying to give her that benefit of a doubt.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, so now Vanessa.
Oh my goodness.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hey, so first, Christina, your book is phenomenal. I just want to congratulate you on the work you did, because just it was meticulously researched, and I'm so grateful to you for writing about Joan. I don't have a question, but more of a comment. So over the years, I've been a classic film fan for most of my life. And over the years, I've seen the majority of Joan's movies. And even I grew up watching Alfred Hitchcock Presents reruns on TV. So then when I sat down to read your book, all of a sudden I discovered that there was a common thread that I had experienced watching all of her films and the TV show. And the common thread was her. And I wish that as a child growing up and as a teenager and a young adult, I had known who she was. And I wish it hadn't taken this long for someone to write a book about this woman, because just her body of work is incredible. So I wanted to thank you so much for finally bringing her to the forefront and having people talk about her. Finally.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now I'm speechless. So
Yeah, think how we feel.
thank you very much. It's really great to hear.
That's awesome. Okay, so now Jan wants to know, while working with Hitch, what was John's relationship with his wife, his other collaborator?
So I do talk about this in the book, and the way that I address it in the book is to keep coming back to it, right? Like there was no way to actually write like one chapter or just a few pages and then leave it alone. And that's because I believe that the relationship kind of between Joan Harrison, Hitchcock, and Alma Reville really changed from kind of year to year and decade to decade. So I think it's pretty clear that Hitchcock was obsessed with Joan Harrison, you know, from the moment that she walked into his office. She was the prototypical Hitchcock blonde. And if he didn't have a fascination with blondes before, which he, you know, I think he did, well, it just kind of like ballooned out when he met her and began working with her on a day-to-day basis. In other words, you know, it just kind of began to feed off of itself in this professional environment. So I believe, therefore, right, that Joan was kind of contending with this. So she was setting a lot of boundaries in terms of their working relationship. And also, as I say in the book, she was also finding herself. So she's kind of projecting and basically kind of emerging as something of a Hitchcock blonde, you know, and reveling in the idea that she could be this other person, this fantasy person, and finding a particular working identity or, you know, like a star identity in this. So she was basically on stage for Hitchcock and in the industry a lot of the time as like a performance, which is, you know, so then Alma Reville is kind of a foil. She's not she's just a different, she looks different, she acts different, she plays a different role in Hitchcock's life. And I guess to try to answer this very briefly or wrap it up, they were friends, right? People describe Alma Reville and Joan Harrison as being sisterly and as being friends. I think at a certain point, Reville decided she didn't want Harrison to be a threat in their relationship. These are people that traveled together all the time. They went on vacations together. When they moved to Los Angeles, right, the Hitchcocks lived on the penthouse of this apartment complex at the Wilshire Palms. Joan Harrison lived on the first floor, and they just kind of went, you know, up and down the stairs all the time. They were a family, and Alma Reville figured out how to negotiate all of these very strange boundaries, which I think is so important to, again, to Hitchcock's films and to Harrison's films, both of which have very complicated approaches to like the family romance, which is what we think of in terms of the subconscious, like erotic dynamics that underplay, mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and daughters.
Great. Darlene, who do we have lined up next?
So Gary's got his hand up again. We don't have any other questions in the chat, so go ahead, Gary.
Okay.
So one of the things I do when I read a book is I flip and I read the captions for all the photographs first. So I was surprised in going through the photographs to see that she was married to Eric Ambler. Sort of like, I was not expecting that. Like, whoa, talk about a power couple. But then as I read the book, and I would love your insight here, because it felt like there was more to the relationship she had with other men than there was to the relationship she had with the man she ended up marrying. It seemed like this was not the most intense of her male romantic relationships. So I was wondering if you felt that way too, or what your insights are.
That's a really good question. It does feel like almost like a final chapter in her life. They were married from 1958 until her death in 1994, so that's a lot of time. And I asked the people that knew her that whether this was a marriage of what they thought, right, what their impressions were, and I got a few different answers, and most people suggested that this was her way of having companionship, someone to travel with. They both really obviously loved books, right? So someone to share, he shared his writing with her, she shared her interests with him, and they had a love of art. So there was that. And then, when I was really kind of doubting just how kind of close and important he was to her, that's when I kind of stumbled upon these letters, basically toward the end of my writing of the book. I finally found Patricia Gaynor, who ended up being a really great source for me. And she was the personal assistant for both Eric Ambler and Joan Harrison. So in the final 2 decades of their lives, she was working as their personal assistant in their home. And she said, oh, well, I just happen to have this box of letters that Eric left for me, right? And do you want to have them? And then of course I said, well, if she's in England, I said, well, just send me, I'd really love to have them. Would you mind sending me copies? And she said, I'll just send you the originals. So there's this intervening week or two where I was hoping that they would make it because there were no copies, but I was really happy to have the originals. And in these letters, they ended up not being quite as many as she suggested there were, but there were about 6 or 7 letters that Joan Harrison was writing when she was living in Los Angeles for a few months, making this TV series for Aaron Spelling. And Eric Ambler was back in in London. And they were very, very, it was just an indication of how much she loved him and missed him. And at least at that point in her life, was incredibly emotionally dependent on him. And there's a deeper story behind it, but I'm not exactly sure I should share it. That has to do with a psychic that led me to believe that I was about to get a box of letters, and then the box of letters arrived. So when I basically was trying to find the love of Joan's life, and so I asked a psychic, and the psychic said, well, if let's ask Joan if she'll show you the love of her life. And then Joan apparently came through and said, it will come in a box. I'll release a dove and it will come in a box of letters. And then literally like a week later, this box of letters arrived. Wow. Right. Patricia Gaynor came into my orbit, and then the box of letters. So
interesting.
For that reason, I don't want to dismiss Eric Ambler.
Yeah.
So Joan set up the last act.
Right.
That's amazing.
Wow, what a great story. That's great.
Okay. Anyone else have another question or have a quick thing they want to ask? If not, I'll go to Jan and then Sue. Jan wants to know, what is your opinion of an overlooked noir 1946 is Nocturne, which was a good film that could have had great casting, such as Jane Greer in the Lynn Barry role, or a better lead than George Raft. Why does everybody hate on George Raft?
I'll tell you why sometime.
Yeah, I know.
Have you been doing research on this?
No.
Probably.
Yeah, I think so. So Nocturne is one of my very favorites. You know, if somebody was to ask me which Joan Harrison movie is your favorite besides Phantom Lady, I always kind of default to Nocturne because it's, you know, behind the scenes of Hollywood, and it just has this really interesting look to it. And there's that fabulous scene with George Raft's mother, you know, and her neighbor, the two older women who are solving the mystery together. And I just think that's a Joan Harrison scene, you know, because she just kind of randomly puts these two women together. And it just seems so out of place in a classical Hollywood movie. So I love Nocturne. I think that my understanding is that that movie was being put together at RKO before Joan Harrison, just like, you know, kind of maybe it had been in development 2 months before Joan Harrison joined RKO. So she came in a little bit into the process. And so George Raft had already been attached, and it was almost as though it was a George Raft movie, you know, and Joan Harrison had to just kind of deal with the elements that were already in place. And then I do understand, and this is why I'm asking how much research you've done, that Joan Harrison suggested that Jane Greer play the female lead, and George Raft said, she's, you know, she doesn't have what it takes, you know, she doesn't have the heft. So I think that already I've also heard rumors that Harrison and George Raft dated. He dated everybody. I think that might have put Joan Harrison off, you know, and created tension between them.
Interesting. Okay, so we'll go to Sue next.
So Joan went through this career where she did a whole number of things. She seemed very calm, cool, and collected. But is there any indication that she had some hard times? You know, as women are out there, of course she had women supporting her, but did she have down times? Did she get depressed or anything that ruffled her feathers?
Yes. So aside from, I mean, the most obvious time was, you know, 1949, 1950, and then moving into the early 1950s when she clearly was afraid of the blacklist and the Red Scare, and she had to leave Los Angeles, and she went to Europe and then to New York, you know, kind of in the early 1950s. And I think she was really lost. I mean, she didn't have, you know, obviously she had money because she had her family's money. So I don't want to portray her as complete, like, living in poverty, but she didn't have a job. She didn't have a contract. She wasn't aligned with the studio. So she was just dangling kind of without any footing. And she was too prideful. This was one of her worst character traits, right? She just had a lot of pride. So she would never go home to Guilford. So, you know, she would starve to death before she would go home to Guilford. So she was really stuck at that time. And so she was like exiled, right, from Hollywood. We know this is kind of one of those questions. She gets this contract with Harry Cohen at Columbia. And she's supposed to start all these movies in 1950. And then after 1 month after getting the contract at Columbia, she's moving to Europe and essentially going into exile. And the question is, you know, why? And it's either because Harry Cohen was so horrible to her, as he often was. He was just, you know, like worse than Harry Weinstein in terms of being a bully, or it was the blacklist, and she realized she just had to get out of town. It was probably the latter. But the other thing, to answer your question more specifically, is I think that she had a lot of ups and downs, you know, like a roller coaster. She would get a fantastic contract, for example, at Universal right before she made The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry. She was riding high, one of the highest paid producers at Universal in 1945. with a 3-picture contract and all the creative freedom in the world. And then 6 months later, because they didn't give her the ending that she wanted and they showed her that they didn't care a wits about her, she walked out and suddenly had, right, no contract, no studio, and was really afraid that she would be left, just kind of left and isolated. So I think her career out, away from Hitchcock lasted about 5 years, and then she was done. It was really, in hindsight, she really didn't have much in terms of duration. She didn't have much time to enjoy her career.
We've got 2 more questions in the chat, and then we'll probably wrap up as we're getting close. John wants to know, did you look into any professional association that Joan Harrison might have had with Gail Patrick, the producer of the Perry Mason TV series?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't. So that's something worth
Something to add to your sequel. Okay. And Jan wants to know, would you talk about the great fortune of being able to interview Norman Lloyd about working with Joan on the Hitch television series?
Yes. And so, I know what's great is that, I believe maybe in the last year, he's probably been a little bit out of the limelight. He's been a little bit more private. I'm not sure how his health is doing, but he's been so fabulous, right, in terms of carrying on film history and also just being visible and being out there. He's 106 years old. I believe he's 106 now. And when I first interviewed him, it was the year 2000. So 20 years, right? 20 years back, 21 years back. That was when I first began to think I might want to write a book about the women, behind Hitchcock. And I sat down with him for about 2 hours in his living room. And he gave me a great interview. He's so warm, he's so cordial. And what's great is that, he'll go off on these tangents, but they're not tangents. He's talking about Jean Renoir and Charlie Chaplin, and, the information and the stories that he has are just so rich that it really does bring film history to life. But then I basically needed more information, and I also would have questions based on things that he told me, and especially when I decided to really dive into the book. So I met him again in 2014. Then I met him again. I asked for another interview about 3 years later. And what I want to say is that every time I met him, everything he told me was the same. It was like and not in the way that somebody says, "Oh my gosh, well, he was just on autopilot." But it corroborated the first interview. In terms of his mind is completely coherent. His memory is better than mine. It's better than almost anyone I know. And so it was fabulous just in terms of knowing that you had a source that was quite reliable.
Wow, what a wonderful experience that must have been, those interviews. Wow.
Yeah. And he's also just such a champion of Joan's, right? He would always say, I also talked to him on the phone a lot, and he would just say, anything for Joan, anything for Joan, what can I do? What can I do for you? He would barely remember who I was. Are you that lady from Florida? Is basically what he would say. Are you still working on that book? Well, anything for Joan.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh, God bless him to be 106 and still with us and still hopefully going strong. We hope so. We hope he's got many, many more years left with us.
Hope so.
Wow. Well, Christina, I know we're getting pretty close to the end of our time. We normally end our programs with recommendations. And I'd like to ask if you can recommend any films connected with Joan Harrison that maybe we haven't talked about, or maybe just something else that you've recently discovered.
I can't recommend much recently. I have to say I haven't been able to watch very much at all. I wish that I could. You all would be much better at recommending movies for me, I think. But I do recommend Nocturne as one that you may not have seen, by Joan Harrison, and of course Ride the Pink Horse. Those are two. They Won't Believe Me is one that I think it's hard to choose what her best film is, you know, but I think it's a kind of competition between They Won't Believe Me and Phantom Lady. So if you haven't seen those two, I highly recommend those two. And then just because it's so odd and beautiful and reckless, you know, and crazy, Nocturne, please try to see those.
Great.
Yeah, and I see we're going through the chat in terms of where to find some of these.
Yeah, and we do have some of those in the library system. We do have Ride the Pink Horses in the system, Phantom Ladies is in the system. I don't know how we're going to get They Won't Believe Me, because right now our library system doesn't do Blu-rays, and I don't know if Warner will put a DVD out as well. Sometimes they do, but that's a terrific one. Even if the library doesn't, and everybody has a Blu-ray player, They Won't Believe Me is terrific. I just love it. And if you've ever thought of Robert Young only as Father Knows Best, you got a big surprise coming when you watch this one. Well, Christina, thank you so much and for joining us tonight, not only to talk about Phantom Lady, but also to share your passion for film, which is just absolutely wonderful. Can you tell us what you're working on now and where we can find you online?
So one of the things I just want to say that I've been able to do, because I'm not like writing a book right now. I'll tell you in a second. I'll give you a hint of what I'm writing, but I've been able to try to learn games. You guys don't go thinking that I'm betraying cinema by any means, but I'm trying to actually turn like a classical Hollywood suspense thriller female investigative thing into a game by teaching myself how to write games. So that's one thing that actually being inside and not doing much has allowed me to explore. I first wanted to turn Joan Harrison's story into a game, and then I realized it would be actually more fun to do something else. But I'm planning on writing a book, and I'm not going to reveal the exact subject, but it's definitely classical Hollywood era, late 1930s, early 1940s, in the world of film noir. There's a court trial involved, so there'll be a little bit of yeah. Yeah.
We're excited.
And also a woman, an embattled woman.
Yeah. Oh, man.
I hope more will be revealed soon.
Good. Well, yeah. We look forward to hearing about that.
Yeah, video game. People are asking. Yeah, literally a video game.
Yeah, a video game. Okay.
Literally.
Literally a video game.
I may have to buy a game system.
Nice. I put a link to Christina's book in our catalog for those who want to get on the wait list.
Yes.
And he said the more people that you get on the wait list, the more copies they'll purchase for the
That's right.
So
That's right.
We want to help that out. So and
I can certainly certainly work on trying to get more of the movies that we discussed tonight in the library system. Any of those we can get, I'd be glad to do that. Yeah, awesome. So again, Christina, thank you so much. This has just been a treat.
Thank you very much.
And we've had a great time, and I hope you'll join us again sometime. You're welcome to drop in anytime. We'd love to have you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
All right. Yeah.
Let me give a shout out to my mom. Hi, Mom.
I know is that Gretchen? She made it in here.
Yeah, she made it in. Yeah, that's great.
All right. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure, everybody.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. I hope to see everybody on May the 7th for our discussion of Billy Liar, and sign up 1 week from today. And until then, everybody take care, be safe, and watch some great movies. All right, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.